thank you everybody for joining us today for this readout of the first inaugural EU-US Trade and Technology Council meeting in Pittsburgh. My name is Tyson Barker, and I am the head of the Technology and Global Affairs program at the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. And I'm very excited to have this conversation about this first meeting that took place last week, what the expectations are and what are the next steps. So I think everybody is pretty familiar with the TTC. It's quite well discussed in circles in Brussels, in Washington, in the transatlantic community, in the tech and trade policy community, but maybe hasn't gotten the kind of socialization that we all want to see it have in the broader foreign policy discourse. So that was one of the motivations to do this, a wrap up with stakeholders to talk about what happened last week and what we can look forward to in the future. And I am delighted to have with us the three, I would say, behind the scenes coordinators of this process. They're some of the people working closely with the principals who met last week, shaping the agenda and crafting what was an excellent statement in my opinion. I hope everybody had a chance to read the joint statement. We will drop it in the box here as well. But it was 17 pages, talked about the work, the scope of the 10 working groups that have been established, with 5 annexes dealing with everything from dual-use export controls to investment screening, to artificial intelligence, to supply chains and semiconductors, and of course, global trade challenges. But I don't want to take up the time and give my impression of Pittsburgh. I want to leave that to the people who are actually there. So I want to introduce them very, very briefly, and then give them the floor, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. So first we have Peter Harrell. Peter Harrell is the Senior Director for International Economics and Competitiveness at the White House National Security Council under the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. Prior to joining the administration, he was an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security and taught law at the University of Pennsylvania. He also served in the Obama administration at the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions at the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs, and was a member of the policy planning staff, and is a leading expert in US economic and I would say technology statecraft. From the European side, we have 2 experts with us, two shapers of this process. The first is Alejandro Cainzos, who is a member of the team, the cabinet of Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager at the European Commission, where he advises her on international aspects of her portfolio, including cybersecurity, defense, 5G, and space policy. He previously advised the Commission's Deputy and Acting Secretary General and held other posts in the Secretariat General and Directorate General for Internal Markets and Services. And prior to joining the Commission, he worked in public affairs in the financial sector. And finally, we have Elīna Melngaile, I hope I got that right, I know it's a Latvian name, who is a member of the cabinet of Valdis Dombrovskis, the Executive Vice President for Trade at the European Commission. She advises the Executive Vice President on transatlantic relations, Eastern Partnership countries, relations to financial sector, sanctions, export credits, and coordination with G7 and G20, among other things. She has also served Mr. Dombrovskis in his role as Vice President for the Euro and Social Dialogue, and has worked for the European Commissioner for Development in matters of human and social development, gender equality, and global health. Prior to joining the Commission, she was an EU Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister of Latvia. So thank you guys all for being here. We'll do a quick hot wash at the top, starting with Peter, then Alejandro, and then Elīna. Then I'll ask a question and we'll go right into the round to get questions and comments from the group. I will just flag at the outset that this is on the record and being recorded. And also that Elīna needs to go in the middle of this. She can't stay for the full hour. So any questions around the European aspects of trade would probably be welcome at the beginning. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Peter.
Well, Tyson, thank you very much, and many thanks to you and to the German Council for organizing this. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to do this discussion about what happened last week in Pittsburgh and what we're doing going forward with two European colleagues I've gotten the pleasure to know pretty well over the last couple of months planning for this. And so thank you guys very much for pulling this together. I'll make just a couple of very brief remarks because I know we want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions, but just a couple of thoughts at the top. The first being, I think, you know, for the US side, we were just so thrilled to be able to host the inaugural TTC. Obviously something that President Biden and President von der Leyen and President Michel agreed to in June as a way of anchoring the US-EU trade and technological relationship, and really setting up a vehicle that we intended on both sides to use to identify practical areas of cooperation. You know, I think for a number of years, probably there'd been a little too much focus in the transatlantic relationship on issues that divide us, and not enough focus on ways that we can work together to develop technological standards, to secure our supply chains, to kind of get ahead of emerging trends, to promote a transition to a green economy and the elimination of fossil fuels by the middle part of this century. And so this was really a vehicle for us to work together in a concrete and tangible way, primarily on issues that unite us. That doesn't mean there aren't differences of opinion that come up through the TTC. There are some tough issues in the transatlantic relationship, and we certainly, you know, there was discussion last week in Pittsburgh on a couple of those, and there will be going forward. But we do see this primarily as a vehicle to work on issues that we need to be working together to set high standards. I'm sure in the Q&A we'll get into, you know, discussion of particular deliverables and some of the particular announcements. But I think from the American side, we were really thrilled, you know, to be able to release with our European partners shared principles on export controls, on investment screening, to really have a robust agenda that we're going to work on together on semiconductor supply chain, something that is vitally important on both sides of the Atlantic. And to work together on AI too. Obviously, an emerging issue that's going to is already and will have impacts on safety online, on a whole range of technologies, on jobs and employment. Looking at that, and then of course, thinking about how do we work together on you know, as we call them, global trade challenges, and in particular, but not limited to those of non-market economies. And how do we cooperate against the adverse impacts and distortive effects globally have had on both of our economies. Final point I'll make is just, you know, we see this as the first of an ongoing process. You know, we focused on a couple of issues last week in Pittsburgh, but those are not the only issues we'll be focusing on going forward. There are 10 working groups covering a wide range of topics, all of which are now up and running, and we'll be carrying forward work not only on the things that were the focus last week, but on the whole range of issues that our leadership agreed back in June to address via the TTC. So looking forward, not just to sort of talking about what has happened, but also the agenda going forward in the months and years to come.
Thank you so much, Peter. I mean, I've already got questions for you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, not least of which is how the TTC plugs into Washington's kind of global tech and trade outlook, specifically with regard to the Quad, but we'll save that for the Q&A. Alejandro, you're up.
Thank you very much, Tyson and DGAP colleagues, for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be with you, to see Peter again, very much share the mutual gratefulness for the great work together leading up to it, and for the gracious hosting in Pittsburgh last week. I think I can agree with everything that Peter said in terms of the framing for it, so I won't repeat it. It was good that we had the meeting, despite the difficulties leading up to it, because it is important that we can make transatlantic progress in areas where we have shared interests and shared values, and certainly trade and technology is such an area. As was said during the meeting several times, it is clear that our combined weight can lead to results and make a global impact much more so than our individual ones. So we have, I think, a strong reason to work together on these issues. Strongly agree with what Peter said in terms of TTC being focused on practical cooperation, on concrete deliverables. That's very much the spirit in which the statement was crafted, and not repeating the formats of the past. It's for us a new way of doing things, and which we have high expectations on. I think the venue for the meeting, it has set a high bar for us to try to match when we host back. It was really remarkable to see the Pittsburgh experience, how it has transformed from a fossil fuel driven economy to a high-tech hub, and that really speaks to what we're trying to achieve through the TTC. So very grateful also for that choice. Very grateful that we had it outside of Washington. I think the personal element is also very important, and the fact that the 5 principals were together for 36 hours straight, pretty much, is also a very helpful way to build a relationship. And we're very happy with the outcome as well. I mean, it is an inaugural meeting set up after only 3 months after the EU-US summit in June, where it was set up, including the summer period. So I think it was a good result to have already some deliverables for the first meeting, but of course the bulk of the work is ahead of us throughout the 10 working groups and the meetings to come. So very much looking forward to continuing. Maybe some quick areas to highlight. Actually, from the tech side, I was going to mention the same too. Peter has mentioned AI, semiconductors. I think AI, we had a very strong outcome. It is very important that the 2 largest economies, with democratic values, can agree on the principles through which AI should be developed and deployed, human-centered, risk-based. And I think this statement really shows that we agree that there is no contradiction between driving innovation while protecting fundamental rights. And I think we've agreed some very concrete projects to show this in practice. So very much looking forward to those. And then on semiconductors, we have agreed on a number of short-term cooperation venues in terms of identifying gaps and vulnerabilities in the supply chain, and we will continue the discussion towards more long-term areas around building resilient, diversified supply chains, while of course avoiding a subsidy race, which would not be in the interest of taxpayers on either side. So I'll leave it at that. I know Elīna will mention a bit more on the trade side, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Alejandro. You mentioned 2 areas that I'm really acutely interested in. The statement did make note of both short-term and mid-long-term runway on semiconductor cooperation, and I will be interested to know what that could entail. And of course, Europe is pursuing AI regulation right now. I wonder how that can converge with what's happening in the United States, but we will get into that in the discussion. Elīna, last but not least, the trade perspective from the European side. You're up.
Yeah, thanks so much, colleagues. I also would like to thank Peter for an excellent organization of Pittsburgh event, and colleagues for making such a big effort, to make it happen. So maybe I can agree with everything what has been already said by Peter and Alejandro. Maybe a few remarks from my side. I think that this first Pittsburgh meeting confirmed that both sides are ready to engage on the strategic issues. And I believe that launch of the TTC will allow us to drive forward a positive bilateral transatlantic agenda. As to the outcomes, I think we sense that we can work together to boost trade and investment, but also talk about how we can strengthen security and technological and industrial cooperation. The idea is to work on policies that reflect our values. I think the meeting mainly confirmed that both sides talk about their strategic choices. And we were not focusing mainly on one country, but we were focusing on how to make ourselves stronger and more resilient when both sides are facing some global challenges. So this is kind of a short overview or a takeaway from the first meeting of the TTC. Now moving on trade, as you saw in the statement, we have agreed to coordinate actions on export controls and exchange information when screening risky investment. So we have agreed on a work program in trade area that would cover non-market economies, trade barriers, and trade and labor. To be honest, I think we have identified already a joint agenda, or let's say we have agreed to work on a strategy where we could identify the ways how we could address non-market economies, including very specific issues like forced technology transfer, IPR issues, or industrial subsidies. The second point is more about what we could do together to avoid unnecessary barriers to trade, in particular in areas of new and emerging technologies. And last not least, we will discuss how we can work on international labor rights, and specifically how both sides together could fight against forced and child labor. We are also hoping to develop more ambitious agenda on trade and environmental issues. As Alejandro and Peter said, this is about forming a unified position, and we believe that this is the best way to strengthen our, let's say, global leadership in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elīna. That was an excellent lead-in from all three of our speakers. I'm going to start with two questions, two very big picture questions, and then what I would ask is that people come in with their questions. My ask from you all is to ask your questions verbally so that our speakers can hear your voices. And please just raise your digital hand and we'll go in the order that people raise their hands. So let me start with my two big questions. One is for Elīna and one's for Peter. Elīna, this had been written about, this was started by Phil Hogan in last year, this idea for a TTC. It was written in a communication that the Commission published after the election of President Biden, then President-elect Biden, as a vehicle for strategic cooperation between the EU and the United States. And now we've had it take place on the 27th and 28th, which in some ways was the biggest deliverable of all, that it took place, because as we know, there were atmospherics in the relationship, particularly around AUKUS, but other aspects, including Afghanistan, that had caused some tensions, particularly between France and the United States, but also other European member states. So my question for you is, to what extent does this process, this initiative, have buy-in from the 27 European member states? And how can the member states feed into this process, have ownership of this process so that it is a success? So that's my first question for you. And for Peter, my question is, how does the TTC on the Euro-Atlantic front play into Washington's kind of global tech and trade landscape? Specifically, how does it relate to this budding cooperation in the Quad? So perhaps Elīna and then Peter, and then we'll go to, we've already got a couple of questions from the audience.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Up until now, we have worked closely with all EU member states. And so at the level of working groups, I know that they are involving member states experts, for example, at their level. We are working at cabinet level and at the level of, the European Commission at all levels. We are involving member states in every step of our discussion. So we think that also talking about the next steps, we will gonna create a way, regularly consult with the member states and exchange information and exchange views on specific issues. And we were really positively surprised to see how much support there is for TTC among the member states. So, and discussions at the COREPER meeting right before Pittsburgh event were extremely positive. Maybe Alejandro, you would like to add something?
No, I can only agree and say that, of course, this is something which the Commission doesn't do on its own. We have a strong mandate. The whole summit statement was endorsed, and the Pittsburgh statement is endorsed. So we're obviously working with member states every single step of the way, and we'll continue to do that.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, and it's an excellent question. I mean, obviously, from a U.S. perspective, we're both an Atlantic country and a Pacific country, and so it makes sense that we'd be thinking about mechanisms for engagement, sort of on with our partners across the oceans on both sides of our country. I mean, there are obvious differences. The Quad has sort of 4 countries in it. The TTC is a government to government relationship with one partner. Our partner has 27 constituent members in it, but the difference is there. And then the Quad obviously gets into a number of security issues as well as economic issues that are not on the agenda with the TTC. But where there are overlapping issues in technology and in the trade space, and there are overlapping issues, for example, in semiconductors and other supply chain issues, as well as issues around technology, standard setting and technical bodies and things like that. We frankly see these from an American perspective as quite complementary. We have a mechanism via the TTC to work on these issues with our European partners. Many of the ideas I think we will be developing there will then be feeding into our Japanese and Australian and Indian partners via the Quad and vice versa. So I mean, I think we broadly, on the areas where there's overlap, we broadly see them as as complementary. I think semiconductors, for example, there's I'm afraid, to be a shortage of semiconductors for quite some time. I think, we are looking with Europe to increase production and to coordinate on that. We're looking with the Japanese in particular through the Quad to, focus on that. So I think from our perspective, we see this as quite complementary as we work around the world to really, rebuild our relationships and show our commitment to our allies and partners everywhere.
Thanks so much. It sparked more questions as well. I mean, that's a good answer. That brings up more questions. So we have 4 people in the queue to ask questions. I would say we take the first 3 and then go back to the speakers. That way we can get hopefully Elīna in there before she has to jump, and then we'll go back for a second round. So we'll take Mark, Bart, and Alice. So Mark, you're first.
Thank you, Tyson, and thanks for doing this. It's Mark Scott. I'm a reporter with Politico. 2 questions for all the panelists. You discussed sort of looking forward. So can you give any specific expectations what you plan to achieve by the second meeting of the TTC, likely in the spring? And secondly, there was discussions around a joint technology competition policy dialogue that is running in conjunction with the TTC. Can you just give some more clarity on what that actually will do in terms of TTC, and will that lead to anything in terms of the platform dialogue, which is one of the 10 working groups? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. All right, Bart, you're up.
Hi, this is Bart Shevchuk. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at GMF and also teach at Sciences Po in Paris. Thanks very much to all three of you for your great remarks. One question for Peter, one question for Alejandro and Elīna, if she is able to come back. For Peter, what is your benchmark for success for the TTC over the next 2 to 3 years? Obviously, with trade deals, it's a little bit easier because there are estimates of job gains and GDP gains. Here, you're starting a cooperative regulatory process, and sometimes it could be a little bit more difficult to translate that into headline deliverables that catch the public's attention and sort of feed into a wider strategic narrative. So what is your sense on that? And for, I guess, Alejandro, there's a little bit of a mismatch in terms of the participation on the European side versus the US side. So whereas you have EVPs Vestager and Dombrovskis, you don't have the HRVP Borrell, whereas you do have the Secretary of State Tony Blinken on the US side. Did the EU consider having the HRVP participate in part also to have this wider, foreign policy impact from the TTC cooperation? Thanks very much.
Thanks, Bart. And then last question from Elise.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alice Panier. I'm in Paris at the French Institute of International Relations, where I head the Geopolitics of Technology program. My question is really for both sides of the Atlantic, so whoever wants to pick it up, I would like to hear views from both sides. The statement mentions the goal of consulting with civil society writ large, including the private sector, to get some buy-in into the decisions and works that the TTC and working groups will undertake. And so I'm interested in hearing how you feel is the mood in business circles regarding areas that the TTC is covering, and whether there are areas where national security or public order priorities will clash with business interests, whether it's export restrictions, reorganization of value chains, ethics of AI, greater scrutiny of dual use, due diligence. A lot of this falls on within the purview of the private sector and businesses. So just curious to hear if there are different fault lines between national security and business on both sides of the Atlantic, if there are fault lines where they lie, and how to ensure that business and industry will support policies, joint policies in these areas. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elise. So we'll go back to the speakers. I don't know if Elīna is with us, but we'll go Peter, Alejandro, and then Elīna if she's there. Just recap the questions and pick up whatever you guys want. What are the expectations for the second TTC, and what about the joint tech competition dialogue? How does this relate? This is for Peter specifically, what is the benchmark for success of the TTC for the US? And for Alejandro, is there a mismatch in participation, and how should Borrell and the External Action Service be incorporated? And then finally, dealing with consulting with civil society, what is the mood in business circles specifically, and how is the TTC going to deal with competing interests and fault lines when national security and public order come up against business interests in the bottom line? So Peter, and then Alejandro.
Well, so I'm happy to go first. So if Elīna is here, because I know she has to leave, maybe we should see if she wants to go first, if she is still here, and then come to me. Elīna, are you still with us? Perhaps not. Well, in that case, I will go. I wanted to offer her, because I knew she was the one who was tight on time, the chance to go. Go first. So I'm not going to take these questions in the order they were given. I'm going to redo the order a little bit, because I really want to start with Elise's question on stakeholder engagement, which I think is an issue that is really important on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think about the way in which we had structured the day out in Pittsburgh, where the very first session was a stakeholder engagement session where our principals were able to hear directly from stakeholders on both sides of the of the Atlantic. There was also a session later in the day on labor and workforce development issues that also heard directly from a number of stakeholders, businesses with workforce training programs. Clearly for this dialogue to be valuable, we need to understand directly from our stakeholders what's on their mind and give them an opportunity to be heard. And I think that's an important fact going forward. I think our principals want to hear from stakeholders going forward. We are also going to have a robust set of stakeholder engagements with all the working groups going forward. We've published points of contact on both sides for all of the working groups. The working groups are going to be doing stakeholder engagement sessions going forward, some of which will be done individually, some of which we're doing jointly as sort of US working group leads and European working group leads to have joint stakeholder sessions. We're both hearing the same comments from both sides of the Atlantic. So I think you're going to see a very robust set of both formal engagements as well as informal opportunities going forward. Hugely important issue for us. On membership, I know that's largely directed to the EU, but I just want to make something very clear. We had no views on European membership. I thought our side, it made sense for us to have Secretary Blinken there, in large part because the State Department actually has a statutory mandate to lead a bunch of our digital diplomacy, and we thought digital and tech issues were going to be very important to this. And just in our system, that is an issue that the State Department, by statute as well as by sort of practice, has a large sort of set of equities in. But we've no views on membership on the other side. That's a European issue from our perspective. Very briefly on this joint competition policy. So we have a a data governance and tech platform regulation dialogue, which is really a policy-focused working group. How we as the US are looking at tech platform regulation issues domestically, share our perspectives on what we're doing with our European colleagues, get feedback, and as they are doing a number of things, to offer our views and have an exchange on what is a set of effective regulatory policies as we deal both with sort of competition policy issues, but also misinformation and algorithmic regulation issues. In the US system, our enforcement cases are handled by independent agencies, by the Federal Trade Commission and by the Department of Justice. And I, as for example, a White House policymaker, have no involvement in particular cases. We wanted to create this sort of parallel structure where there was kind of an enforcement to enforcement dialogue where the folks working on particular cases could strengthen cooperation on that, because I think there are many of the same kinds of cases going on, but that's something that we on the policy side of the house can't be involved in. So that's why we set up these kind of parallel working groups. In terms of deliverables, the final point in terms of deliverables, I think we are very focused on how do we measure success and what are concrete deliverables? And I think, Bart, your question, this isn't going to be kind of one single agreement or announcement wrapped up in a bow. I think it's going to be a set of, concrete outcomes across a number of different areas of cooperation. To give sort of an example, as I look at semiconductors, how are we going to measure success on semiconductors, right? Well, we are both looking to make, very significant investments on both sides of the Atlantic in expanding semiconductor capacity. I think success will be measured 2 years from now. Have those investments been made in a complementary fashion rather than in a fashion where we have let companies play us off against each other to maximize subsidy rates? Have we addressed the kind of full suite of semiconductor nodes of production where we need to see it, right? We're thinking about very concrete kinds of things that will be, measures of success on semiconductors. And I think on AI, will we have come up with, some joint meaning and implemented, some meaningful standards on how AI can and cannot be used for social credit scoring, right? We don't want to see AI used for social credit scoring. Have we come up with some meaningful, concrete rules there? And so I think it's really more of kind of issue by issue where you're going to see specific announcements rather than one kind of overarching, 90-page thing that's tied up in a bow.
Thanks, Alejandro.
I think Peter made my life incredibly easy because he already, I think, addressed all the questions in the same way I was planning to. So in terms of stakeholder engagement, I agree with what he said in terms of the format. I would just add that in general, the feedback we're getting is extremely positive, both from the business community, but also from civil society and other interest groups. And I think this enthusiasm was pretty clear in Pittsburgh in the morning session, which I thought was excellent and very diverse, which is also important. In terms of policy or political action going against business interests, I think what we consistently hear is that unilateral, not coordinated action is what hurts businesses the most, especially when they are present on both sides. And working on common standards make business life easier, especially for SMEs who cannot afford law firms on both sides. So I think from that perspective, I'm not too worried about what we're doing here. On the, let's say, lack of symmetry of representation, I will reply to it the same way Peter did, is for statutory reasons in their side, for statutory reasons on our side in terms of our institutional setup. It was decided that the two EVPs will co-chair it, but that doesn't mean that we don't follow a whole of government approach in the commission. And I think Peter has met probably people from how many DGs already and the External Action Service, who was, by the way, present also in Pittsburgh. So we do follow a whole of government approach, and we always said that the two EVPs will co-chair it, but the participation will be open to other members of the college as we go along. In terms of the competition dialogue, again, same answer. We have the same constraints in terms of independence when it comes to casework. Even here within the cabinet, I don't see any cases. That's my colleagues down the corridor. So we for reasons of confidentiality keep them separate, and it hasn't started yet because I understand some confirmations are still pending on the US side, but I hope we can get running with that soon. And I think I strongly agree with what Peter has said in terms of measuring success. It will really be an issue by issue assessment, and I think we have our quite clear work cut out for us in section 3 of the statement, where we try to be as concrete as possible when telling our 10 working groups what to do.
All right, let's take another round of questions. We got 3 hands up, and we will take all 3. So Stormy, Raquel, and then Paul Timmers.
Great, thank you so much. I'm Stormy Miltner. I'm the director of the Aspen Institute in Germany, and before I was at BDI responsible for foreign economic policy issues. And thank you so much for these really insightful contributions. I already learned a lot. What I'm interested in is investment screening and the exchange of information between the two sides of the Atlantic. And I think it might have been Peter or Elīna earlier on said, well, we do have 27 member states on the EU side. And on investment screening, we do have a coordination mechanism. But in general, I mean, there's still not quite 27, but quite a few very different investment screening mechanisms. So I would be interested in learning how the coordination is going to work, and if this involves both the criteria for investment screening and also the information on maybe harmful national security endangering investment, which is spotted on both sides of the Atlantic. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Stormy. Raquel?
Hi everyone. Well, it's Raquel Jorge from El Canary Institute in Spain. I am a policy analyst on tech and digital policy. Well, so first of all, congratulations on the first meeting in Pittsburgh. I think that the TCC clearly shows that there is ground for cooperation. So my question is on third countries' engagement in the TCC working groups agendas, because the statement states that the TCC will work on capacity building assistance to third countries in export control regimes, policies and practices, also on information sharing for global trade challenges, and as well development finance for secure digital connectivity, among others. So I have two brief questions. The first one is, so I wonder how the TCC will set the bar on this topic, so on engaging third countries, because it is not indeed one of the short-term issues which have resulted from this first meeting. However, the more defined the objectives with third countries are set since the beginning, which is decided from now on will be. Sorry, I mean that the more defined the objectives with third countries are set, the more effective and feasible any policy, either short or long term, which is decided from now on will be. And I am also interested in knowing how this development finance cooperation will be done, considering especially the European Union's new digital partnership in the Indo-Pacific, and as well the US Quad Alliance goals in the technology realm, and also due to the lack of a specific strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean in the tech realm, which is as well much necessary. Thank you.
Thanks, Raquel. Paul Timmers.
Hi, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I have a question to the panelists and actually also a question to Tyson, but perhaps he wants to hand that over to the panelists. But one question to the panelists is there are certain areas where there is a lot of transatlantic interest for cooperation, but they haven't been included. Perhaps, and that's my question, why not? Perhaps they are considered immature. So I'm thinking, for example, of interests that has been formulated at the EU side around trusted cloud. So things like Gaia X as a European initiative could have been a transatlantic one, or data spaces, of which there is a whole range of them, at least in the European scene, but I can imagine that environmental data spaces, health data spaces, industrial data spaces would have been of interest. So then my question to Tyson, if I may. So Tyson, you wrote really an excellent piece on the TTC liftoff. And there's an intriguing sentence there where you say that at its heart, the TTC is the embryonic basis for a Euro-Atlantic Tech Alliance. So what is an embryonic basis? What is going to be, if this is the embryo, what is the child going to be? What do you think about it? What is that you have in mind, and what would the panelists have in mind? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul. Those are excellent questions. So maybe I can take that first one and then recap the questions to the speakers. I mean, embryonic, you hit the word on the head. It's not decided yet. We have the basis for something. We have 10 working groups. This is me as an outside observer to this process. Some of these seeds are going to bear fruit, and some are not. And I think that was an approach that was taken deliberatively, because they're trying to, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic, see where the interests lie and where the political circumstances allow for the greatest amount of cooperation. That could be in green tech, that could be in semiconductor supply chains, that could be in data governance and platform regulation. It could be in many areas, investment screening, export controls, etc. I think that the pieces are all there, but I think there are questions about buy-in, political will, and of course timing, which is always the big question for politics and foreign policy. But I will leave it to the people who are actually shaping this to give their assessment, along with the other questions that we had, and I'll just recap them very briefly. So first, we had a question on investment screening and exchange of information. How does the coordination mechanism work within the EU, and how will it work in a transatlantic or Euro-Atlantic context? What are the nodes of that coordination and cooperation? Is it criteria for investment screening, and is it also information sharing around individual cases? And I know that might be have been a question for Elīna, but I will still give it to Alejandro. The second question was on a third country plug and play. What are the mechanisms for third countries to participate? How is the TTC going to engage third countries? And specifically around questions around capacity building, financing for connectivity, joint cooperation in the global south, I would say, in middle and low income countries. And I think that the speaker, Raquel, mentioned specifically Latin America and the Caribbean. And then the third question was, so what about the whataboutism, the techno whataboutism? Why not trusted cloud? Why not data spaces? All very important and definitely issues that are on the horizon and are going to be important in the transatlantic context as well. So perhaps we can go this time reverse order, Alejandro and then Peter.
Well, I would have wished Peter to go first, because on the investment screening, as you rightly say, I'm a bit off turf here. No, I mean, it is clear that as far as I can talk about this, the setup we have in the EU is one where the Commission has a coordination role that to ensure consistency, and to help our member states and look at particular cases where there are cross-border implications or EU-wide implications. But it remains the case that every individual decision rests with the member states upon their national security reasons. We issue opinions. So I think that in a way answers the question of how the cooperation is framed, as we obviously cooperate on areas which are of our competence. On third countries and participation, the TTC is a bilateral vehicle, but we always said since the beginning that, and this is both in the summit and then in the Pittsburgh statement, that the results of what we do in the TTC and the agreements and common ground that we find would then feed into other processes, other formats, be that or other bilateral relationships, be that, for instance, the international standardization organizations or other multilateral venues, because it goes without saying that if the EU and US can agree on higher standards, it will be easier for us to raise the bar globally, and I think that's really what we're trying to achieve here. In terms of development finance, I think this is a very promising area, since we have not only the resources, but also the same very aligned, I would say, interests and values that we want to promote when it comes to closing the digital divide, while at the same time making sure that human rights and respect for individual freedoms are part and parcel of that. It will take a little bit more time. We are on the EU side now getting our ducks in a row. We will come with the communication on connectivity, which the President announced in her State of the Union speech for Global Gateway in some weeks. And we're going to take it from there. We are in parallel doing the programming for our funding for the next 7 years. So I think we will need a bit more time to be ready on our side to engage in a more concrete way, but it's certainly a shared intention to work together on that. And finally, on the areas not included, actually cloud is included. So if I'm not mistaken, in the working group 4, it is one of the critical infrastructures that we've agreed to look at together when it comes to security, competitiveness, and other matters. And that work will now start. And I think on data spaces, the answer is a bit similar. In the EU, we're still working on that. We have the Data Act coming up, so I think this is an area which requires some more internal work in the outset.
Thanks, Alejandro. Peter?
I have to say, I appreciate you asked Alejandro first, because I don't have a lot to add. And I think he said very eloquently most of the points I would have made. I mean, the only thing I'd add on the data issue is exactly, I mean, look, we have a very broad agenda in the TTC, including, as Alejandro mentioned, cloud, which is part of trusted infrastructure, also involving, telecommunications and networks, mobile telecommunications networks and cables. On the sort of, there was a decision agreed on both sides very early on. We were going to keep negotiations on a US-EU adequacy agreement, data flow adequacy agreement separate. Those negotiations started prior to the TTC, so there was already kind of a rhythm going there prior to this, and those negotiations have been ongoing in a sort of a separate constructive track, but there's sort of no why reinvent the wheel by putting them in this. So when they were going along well, I just echo what Alejandro said on investment screening. I mean, from an American perspective, we very much, have begun. We were very pleased to get the sort of joint declaration of principles out, and look at this as a vehicle to cooperate both on sort of some sort of high-level strategic approaches to investment screening, as well as to compare, notes on trends we're seeing and that kind of thing. Obviously, given the way the EU implements investment in European member states implement investment screening, we also have a dialogue with a number of European member states about specific cases that would impact them as well as us, and we view this as additive to the dialogue we have with various member states. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Peter. We have 2 questions in the chat, and I'm going to kind of tack on a couple of questions from my side to these, and then we'll start to slowly land this discussion. So one question is there any chance of the UK being invited to participate in the TTC? And I would add with that, what about the role of NATO? And when I think about things like investment screening, I think about dual-use export controls. I think that traditionally in the Cold War, when you were talking about conventional, let's say non-digital technology, tech governance and access and control, NATO had played a role in the past. Is there a role for NATO to play in talking about investment screening, trustworthy vendors, dual-use export controls in the future, together with the EU and the United States? So that's one question, UK and NATO. And then the second is from Paul Timmers. He asks about, what about cloud as an industrial collaboration in the Gaia X sense, or in some of the Alliance for Industrial Data and Cloud. We also have a European European Chips Act coming out. We have the US Chips Act. So let me actually take his question and broaden it a little bit and say, what about cooperation in innovation industrial policy, in tech industrial policy for next generation technologies? Because both sides of the Atlantic are experiencing somewhat of a renaissance in industrial policy. And how are we knitting the Euro-Atlantic economies together to make sure that both sides are kind of better integrated in that area as well? So maybe this time we can start with Peter and then go to Alejandro.
Sure, and I know we just have a couple of minutes left, so I'll be very brief, and I'll take your questions in kind of reverse order, Tyson. I think absolutely we see the TTC as an important avenue to cooperate on, like your phrase, kind of innovation industrial policy. I mean, I think you've seen us begin to announce our intention to do that vis-a-vis semiconductors, as we are both making investments on semiconductors. And I could easily see the TTC cooperating on other aspects of innovation, industrial policy. I think, we're trying to balance starting in a couple of concrete areas where we can make concrete and tangible progress, rather than trying to cover the whole world all at once. But certainly that is, this idea of kind of cooperation as we both look at these kinds of investments on different sides of the Atlantic is something we see as part of the TTC. In terms of other, look, I mean, this is a US-EU Trade and Technology Council. I mean, I think obviously the EU has dialogues with other countries. We have dialogues with other countries. I think for us, this is a way to really strengthen the transatlantic US-EU alliance. Between the United States and the European Union at the union level. And so I don't think we have sort of plans to have other members or anything. This is a US-EU, and we have other dialogues with other countries. I mean, NATO, you raise an interesting point about NATO, and I think from an American perspective, obviously there are very important discussions we had at NATO around cybersecurity and cyber attacks and cyber norms. I mean, I think they're complementary kinds of discussions to be had with NATO on the digital and cyberspace that are complementary to some of the more kind of economically focused discussions that we're having through the TTC. So I think we don't see them as sort of mutually exclusive in any way.
Thanks. Alejandro, final word.
We're going to finish on time because I can just agree with the answers Peter gave on both questions. And actually on NATO, we're working on a new joint declaration for EU-NATO cooperation, building on the previous two I believe it was 2014-16, if I'm not mistaken. with the goal of having it by end of the year. So as I said at the beginning, TTC is a bilateral structure, but we see it very much as the progress we can make here feeding into other fora and discussions.
Thanks so much, Alejandro. And thanks to you and Peter and Elīna for being here today. This has been a very rich conversation. I know that the European Union is moving into a space where it's going to engage even more greatly in questions around European security. And of course, technology and national or European security are going to be really deeply intertwined. So I think that this is the perfect time to launch the TTC. And there's going to be a lot of action coming in the coming months, including, and I'll flag this for everybody here, a stakeholder meeting on October 27th on dual-use export controls. So we all want to be part of that discussion. But until then, and then after that, of course, we want to engage with the second TTC meeting, which will take place in Europe, perhaps in Brussels, perhaps in France, who knows. But until then, I want to thank all of our discussants and all of our guests, participants. This has been a really good discussion, and we will be in touch. Thanks, everybody.